Hello everyone, Giltar here with an action figure review. This time we'll be looking at Sergeant Forge from McFarlane Toys' Halo Wars collection series of action figures. Sergeant Forge is from their 7th series or 7th wave of action figures, which was recently released in March of 2010. Now in Canada here, I found it priced at my local Walmart for $13 Canadian. I'm assuming in the United States it's between $10 to $12. Now, this is what's called a 6-inch figure line. However, as you can see, Sergeant Forge here is not as tall as my RX-782 Gundam, which is a 1:144 scale high-grade Universal Century model kit. Now, this model kit here is only 5 inches tall, and Sergeant Forge really only goes up to the Gundam's shoulder. So, even though it's a 6-inch action figure line, it might be somewhat off in that if you look here at the 3.75-inch War Machine from Iron Man 2, it's supposed to be a 3.75-inch action figure, and it really ends up being more like a 4-inch or 4-inch plus action figure in terms of height. So take the whole 6-inch action figure line sort of category or classification with a grain of salt. Now granted, there are other figures in the lineup which are taller. And for example, Sergeant Forge is what I assume to be a normal human. The Spartan characters from Halo should be taller because I believe they're larger humans because of physical augmentation, and they wear the Mjolnir armor, and that powered armor makes them a little larger than normal. So to give you guys an example, I'll move Sergeant Forge back here. On the back of the box we have Sergeant Forge here on the side, and this is a female Spartan character which looks about as tall, but then if you look at the male Spartan characters, if these are all sort of accurate in terms of the photography, they are larger than Sergeant Forge, so they may end up being 6-inch figures if you're looking at the Spartan figures. Now I don't know this for a fact because this is my first Halo action figure. Now if you look up top here, there's a Brute figure and an Elite figure, which they do look bigger than the Sergeant Forge figure, so they're definitely I guess more accurate to the 6-inch range. Now actually I do have this Brute figure, Tartarus, which I'll be reviewing afterwards. So this is just to give you guys an idea of at least the Series 7 lineup and the possible size comparisons between those figures. Now on the front of the box you'll notice here it says 26 moving parts, and that's the reason why I bought this figure, because for years I've stayed away from McFarlane Toys figures. The reason being is that the majority of those products seem to be essentially well sculpted statues with some limited points of articulation, and they're so limited in that they don't really look like they can do much more than stand or whatever in their default position. You might be able to move a head around or an arm and a leg, but you really can't make it pose in any other way. And I'm really more interested in action figures rather than statues, so I stayed away from the McFarlane Toys figures for years. And again, the only reason why I picked up this figure was that it, like normal for McFarlane Toys products, had a great sculpt, great paint application, but it said 26 moving parts, so to me that meant articulation, and thankfully that was correct on my assumption. Now before I get into articulation, I'll go over the weapon accessories. It has 3 sets of weapons. The first being this shotgun here, which can only be held in its right hand, which is a trigger finger hand. The left hand is sort of a grip hand, which you can hold things like the front portion of the shotgun. The shotgun is really nicely detailed. I like the design because it is more sort of realistic in design. It is a futuristic weapon, but it doesn't deviate into the ray gun area of design that you'll see in some futuristic sci-fi weapons. Very nice details. It only has 2 colors though, this sort of matte black for the body and a sort of matte, sort of silverish, grayish, maybe gunmetal color for the top here. The second weapon accessory is this pistol, which can be held in this holster, which has a strap here. Very nice functional piece of accessory and costume design. The pistol is similar to the shotgun in that it really doesn't deviate in terms of design much from real-world modern firearm design. And again, it has just a matte black and a matte sort of dull gray paint for the weapon here. And this can also be held in the trigger finger hand. The third and final set of weapons are these 2 frag grenades, which have holes in them, and you just basically peg them onto the back of the belt. And the frag grenades are pretty neat in that you can hold them or place them in the left hand here. If you find the right position, it actually does fit in somewhat by friction, and you can have it held fairly securely. You just have to sort of play around with it. Now getting into articulation, Sergeant Forge here has some really good articulation. Not the best, because a lot of it is hindered by points of sculpt in the design, the armor bits and such. But that's more realistic in that it shouldn't have gymnastic level flexibility, because he's wearing armor, and fairly bulky armor. So starting off with the feet, which are my favorite, the ankle joints are great because you have a swivel point, which is pretty standard, but you also have a hinge point for slight forward and back and side to side movement, which means Sergeant Forge can actually spread the legs somewhat and have the soles of the feet remain flat on the surface, which is so important for posability of action figures and of model kits. If you can't keep the feet flat on the surface, it's not going to be able to be posed that well. You have to find really sort of odd and tricky positions for it to be posed in a standing position. And here's the thing: one of my nitpicks for articulation and posability is the ankle joint, because that's so fundamental to, you can have really great articulation for the rest of a figure, but if it has poor ankle joints, you can't do much with it because it can't stand up. And personally, I'm not a big fan of using figure stands unless I'm posing a figure in sort of an aerial jump kick or leaping pose or something. If I want a figure to stand, I want it to be able to stand on its own without the assistance of a stand, because figures should not have to have a stand in order to simply stand up like this. Now, moving on to the knee, it has 1 point of articulation. Not the greatest bend, but again, it's the sculpting of the figure. And, again, it makes sense. I don't mind the fact that it doesn't have a flush bend. Now, the hip joints are pretty standard in that it's a swivel hinge combination. So you have swivel movement for moving it forward. You can't really move it back that much, and you can really move it to the side a lot for a high kick. Now the only problem is that the sculpting here, the visual appearance, is sacrificed, because when Sergeant Forge is standing up, it looks fine. But once he does a side kick, that's when you see this considerable gap that looks unnatural here. But I mean, that's a sacrifice. You either have great articulation or great sculpting. In this case, you have a compromise, which you have a bit of both. So I don't mind that. For the waist, there is no articulation, and I don't really mind it because it would just sort of compromise the sculpting, the great sculpting of the rig belt here. However, you do have articulation for the torso, just around the rib cage area. There's a pivot point or a ball joint inside to allow bending and turning movement. The neck itself connects to the base of the skull via ball joint, so you have rotational movement and the ability to bend or nod up and down. The shoulders have limited articulation in that they are swivel hinge joints, but the shoulder armor on either side does limit it. So you can only move up this arm this much. This arm can move a little further. Rotation, it can only move that much before it gets in the way of the back. The elbows, or rather before I get to the elbows, the biceps do have a swivel point for rotation. The elbows have also a single point of articulation for a 90-degree bend, and there is a swivel point just below the elbow for rotation there as well. The wrists have swivel or rotational capability and hinged movement. And that's it for articulation. So overall, it actually has a really good range of articulation. Not the best, but I mean, it has a good combination because it has a great sculpt with a good range of articulation, and that's just a really nice compromise in my opinion. Now, as far as the details of the sculpt, it's just fantastic. No pink application errors as far as I can see on my figure here. Just really well done. The body armor looks great. He really does look like a futuristic, though in the in not so distant future, sort of soldier. And I really like the look of the body armor. All the straps, the little buckles, all the different components that get into it, and just the fine grooves of these sort of almost like panel lines back here. Just, it looks great. And beneath that you see his sort of camouflage uniform there as well. And the biggest thing for me, the biggest strong point of this figure is the sculpting, and specifically the proportions. It's very often that we see really just poor proportions in action figures, and even though we're talking about superhero figures or whatever, which are not real, they're normally human or humanoid type characters, and they just have really poor proportions. They look really cartoonish and caricatures and just really difficult to believe. Whereas Sergeant Forge here, he looks like an actual person in action figure form, and that's helped by just the realistic proportions of his body. As an art student who has a focus on the human body and anatomy, I always sort of nitpick these things, and I have nothing to nitpick about Sergeant Forge. He just looks great, and it's really helped by the great head sculpt here. It's very rare to see such a realistic head sculpt on an action figure, especially at this scale. I mean, this guy is less than 5 inches tall. And to be honest, I think the sculpt is fantastic. That's the strongest point, and it's only helped by the good range of articulation and the good sort of assortment of accessories in the shotgun, pistol, and frag grenades. So overall, I'm going to say I recommend this action figure. In general, if you're interested in action figures, look for one of the Series 7 figures, especially Sergeant Forge. Just a very well done product. If you're a Halo fan, definitely go for this, because this is a top-notch figure for any Halo collector. So this is a great first experience for me in the Halo line of products. Again, I really do recommend this, so I hope you guys enjoyed this review and got something out of it. And I'll see you guys next time at another review.